1992, and I'm here with Leo Vandewalker. And about 2 weeks ago, I came with his daughter-in-law, Jean, and he was sharing with me some of the experiences he had with, I'll call it the train wreck right now. And I decided, and Leo agreed, that it'd be really a neat present to give his family and the Myler family for Christmas this year, is a story about the train wreck that where he lost his leg, and Franz and the Myler father was killed on this wreck. And I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was something we should always remember, and we could probably do it best and to have Leo tell a story. He's a great storyteller, and from that I'd like to turn it over to Leo, and I think this will be a great Christmas gift for both families. Leo, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll start out first by saying Wayne Myler was one of the nicest fellows I was ever around, and I'll pick that up later. However, I'll start right at the beginning. On January 29th, our crew, which consisted of Bill Benz, the conductor, and Wayne Myler was the senior brakeman, and he was the rear brakeman, and I was the junior brakeman, so I was on the locomotive. But we were called to take the meat train out of year number 76 at 4:30 in the afternoon. We went down to South St. Paul and picked up the meat at Swift's, and we left town. And by the way, that day, it was a sunshiny day. I think that I didn't have my heavy coat on. I just had what's called a beach vest, with most railroad men in those days. And then we took off, and it was still a nice day. We went down to Hayfield, which is 81 miles, and we stopped and picked up about 10 cars of meat from Hormel plant in Austin. And when we left there, we had 74 cars of meat and 1 car of apples ahead of the caboose. But after we left Hayfield at about 7 p.m., 8 p.m., why, it started snowing, and by the time we got to Sargent, which is the next town, it was coming down heavy, and from there on until morning it snowed heavily all night. But we were going fine. But when we got to the town of Teope, there's a railroad crossing there, and you have to know that you have a green signal if you go by it. You have to have a green to go by it, so that you tie it up so that somebody can't come across and meet you at the intersection. So in order to do that, the engineer went down as close as he could try to stop the train, and then I had to walk down and make sure that the signal was clear. And when he come down real slowly, I give him the sign that it was clear, and we went on through. The seeing was that hard. So we got by there, but by this time now there was a passenger train behind us, number 26, and we were getting close onto their time. So when we got to McIntyre, we had to head in off of the main track to get out of their way to give them the right-of-way. So we got there, and I dug the snow out of the switch so we could get the train headed into the passing track, and we pulled in, and when the rear of the train was in, so that Wayne could line the switch back up to the main line, why it was convenient for me because the locomotive was right in front of the depot at McIntyre. Okay, the passenger train came and went, and in a little while, why, Wayne and Bill come walking into the depot, and due to the fierceness of the storm, these two fellows, from the wind blowing the snow in their face and their eyeballs apparently melting it, or their face melting it, and each had an icicle at least a foot long directly from their eye back. They looked like two bullhead fish when they came walking into the depot, and finally knocked them off. But anyhow, the locomotive was taken around and went up and took on some more coal because there was so much snow in the tender that as the fireman was augering in what he thought was coal, part of it was snow, and it was killing his fire. So we were around McIntyre there for several hours, and we decided that it was not fit to go, that we couldn't even find the switches to get out of town, but the superintendent back in St. Paul, in the meantime, had been called down to the office, and a fellow by the name of Halverson was on the phone with the conductor, and in other words, he told us we had to go. So at about 6 o'clock the next morning, why, we dug our way out of the main line switch and we started out, and about the time we were leaving there, it stopped snowing for about 5 minutes, it seemed. Because the minute we got out on the main line and going, it started again. So everything went fine. We went down through Riceville, we went through Acme, we went through Alma, and then we went down through Alta Vista, and of course we were running at 55 miles an hour. But just east of Alta Vista, there's a cut, meaning that the railroad track is down in a valley, and this valley was probably, well, when I figured it out afterwards, out of the 75 cars that we had, this cut was probably 40 car lengths long, which 40 times 40 would be so many 1,600 feet. And it was, the snow in this cut was 20 feet deep. In fact, the train went right into it like a snake in the hole. But the locomotive finally come out the front end, but about that time, why, we lost our air, meaning that the train broke in two for some reason, and when the air leaks out of the hose, the brakes set and you stop. So when we stopped, the locomotive was just short of a railroad crossing. There was a farmhouse on our right, but when I stepped off of the back of the tank, which is probably 12, 14 feet off the ground, I walked right off onto the level of the snow. And then I went back down behind there, and we had a hold of about, in other words, the train broke in two about 10 cars back. So I walked back there, and I closed the angle cock to shut off the air, and then we signaled the engineer, and we backed down to see where the train was. And by the time we got down there, why, the conductor had walked up. Wayne, in the meantime now, had gone back to the depot. And Wayne put down 2 torpedoes on the track in front of the depot at Alta Vista, but this will be a question later. And then he went in the depot and got on the telephone, and he talked to dispatcher Paige Brown back in St. Paul and told him of our situation, and Brown said that he would protect our train. So then Wayne started back to where we were. But anyhow, the conductor and I got back to where the 2 pieces of the train was together, and we figured out what happened. Most couplings on a freight train, when you pull the pin, it's on the top side of the drawbar. But some newer fangled ones at that time had the pin on it was an underslung pin. When you pull the handle, it pushed the pin up from the bottom. Well, apparently snow had rolled up under the train, and a chunk of it hit this pin and knocked it up, and that let the train come apart, and the air hoses came apart, and the train stopped. So that's how we got there, or why we got there. Otherwise, I think we would have got through with the speed that we had going. So the next move we made, we coupled the train back up, and then we went up and cut the engine off, and we run the locomotive back up to this little road crossing, and we all walked over to the farmhouse, and the farmer and his wife made breakfast for us. It was probably 7 o'clock in the morning then. And then Bill, the conductor, he called the depot, and by that time of day, it must have been 8 o'clock, because the operator was on duty then, and then the conductor cleared with him our situation of where we were and what we were doing. So we had already worked 19 hours, and 16 is as long as you're allowed to work by law. So we were instructed to what's called tie up, meaning that you're done working and said, go back to your caboose and stay there, and we'll come out from O-line, which is from the engine end of the train, with a snowplow and get you out of there. So in other words, our work was done. We had the train protected from the front end and the rear. So we walked back down there. Well, Wayne and Bill walked back, and the young fella at the farmhouse asked me if I wanted to go back on horseback, and I said, yeah, that's fine. Well, it worked good down the road, but pretty soon we had to go across the field to get to the caboose. Well, this poor little horse with us two on, and we'd walk on the snow a little way, then he'd sink down, and his tummy hit the snow, and he couldn't move anymore, so we'd jump off, and he'd jump out like a jackrabbit. We'd get back on, and away we'd go again. But anyhow, he got me down to the caboose, so the three of us went in there. We took off our heavy clothes. We were just sitting there in probably a wool shirt and a pair of wool pants and our overalls over. Caps and everything was gone. And Bill was sitting on one side, I was sitting on the other, and Wayne was sitting in a chair in the middle. And we were just sitting there visiting. And I do remember, though, that at 12 o'clock, for some reason, I got up and I looked out the back window of the caboose, and I could not see the signal at the east end of Alta Vista because the snow was still so heavy, but of course that's probably a quarter of a mile, which is understandable. But the thing about it was that I pegged the time because I turned around to the fellows and said something like, well, it's 12 o'clock, who's going to cook something to eat? Something along that line, and we made a joke of that. Well, from my walk from that end of the caboose back to the seat that I was going to take was the last walk that I made with two legs. Because at 9 minutes after 12, the locomotive hit us. Now, the history of that locomotive getting there was this. It came over to McIntyre from Rochester with the night passenger train, and the engine stays there, but the two cars, this passenger train I tell you about 26 that passed us there, picked them up and went on. He stayed there till morning to get the morning train going back, and he goes back to Rochester, but he was in town there that day. And this Page Brown, the dispatcher, is the guy that got the idea of sending him down. There was 3 section men from McIntyre was in the cab of the engine, and then he came on down, but see, he was off in a branch line, is not too familiar with the main line. But anyhow, he was running down there, and then when they got to Elma, the next town short of Alta Vista, they stopped again, and the section foreman there and 2 more section laborers got on. So now we've got 6 men and an engineer and a fireman in the cab of this engine. And the section men were all standing across this thing, and the firebox is right ahead of them. Okay? It's just 2 miles up over the hump from Elma to Alta Vista. And if the engineer, or I'm surprised the section foreman wasn't aware of where they were in such a short distance, but anyhow, this engineer was disturbed and he took off with them and away they went. And they went through 2 red signals going into, one into Alta Vista. They hit the 2 torpedoes that Mylord put down, and then he went out by the east block leading to the next town, and that had to be red because we'd been sitting there for hours. But he came right on by there, and when he hit us, it was the first he woke up that he had done something wrong. Well, Bill Benz, the conductor, went that way, clean out 60 feet out to the right-of-way fence, and they tell me he was sitting there like he was in a lounge chair, only his head was badly cut up. And I went down and out, apparently, because I stayed close to the caboose. And the first thing I felt, I knew I was spinning. I got a nauseated feeling in my stomach. And so I just closed my eyes. I wasn't knocked out. And when things came to a stop, I started looking around, and I saw this locomotive alongside of me, and I'm laying right under what we call the cylinder cocks, and excess water from the steam drips out there all the time, and it was dripping right on the hand part of my leg. And I saw these chips of wood all around, so I knew that we had been hit and that the caboose had to be kindling wood just by looking at it. However, where I wasn't injured, I started checking myself, and I was finding that I wasn't hurt, and I just checked my right leg, and that was fine, and I was ready to check this other one when the fireman from the locomotive that hit us came down, And I was talking to him for a minute, and I said, I think that I'm okay. I said, no, he says, your leg is gone. He says, well, when he said that, why, I just leveled right out, and I just completely calm. And I said, okay, around this caboose, there's some telephone wire off my portable telephone. Get a piece of wire, we'll put a twist on this thing. By the way, we got hit at 9 minutes after 12. However, when I got this watch back, and I'll tell you about that later, the crystal was gone, the second hand was gone, and the hour hand is gone. And when you shake it, it sounds like it's got marbles inside of it. But the reason it's like that is because I had that on a chain hooked on the front of my overalls, and while I was spinning, this little cold shut on here, it's a gold ring, opened up and let the watch go sailing. And it went out into the snow someplace, but I'll get on with that later. Okay, so as I laid there in the snow, I knew the conditions of the roads, and I knew the extent of this storm, and I knew that we were about 16, 17 miles from New Hampton, the closest hospital, and with my leg gone completely, it wasn't just partly twisted, it was gone slick and clean at the knee. I knew that I had maybe 1/2 or 1% chance of getting to the hospital. So I just had a talk with the Lord, and I told him, Lord, if you have something else, I haven't finished my work on earth, why, then you will have to do a miracle to get me out of here. Because otherwise, there's no way, physically, that with my leg gone, that I can wait for an ambulance to get here through this and get to the hospital. Or other than that, then if it's my time, then I am ready to go. But apparently, he had something else for me to do, because pretty soon, I know that they had to run a snowplow out across these fields to get a pickup truck out there to haul us fellas in, and I think I was the first one to go in for some reason, maybe because I was there handy, but anyhow, I was the first one to go, and it was a plowed field, but they went so fast they were knocking the wind out of me, and I finally told the fellas that was riding in the back of the truck with me to slow him down. So he did, but I got down to the depot, and there was people there. A woman gave me some hot coffee, a doctor gave me a shot, and how long I was there I don't know, but anyhow, now I was starting to come and go. But I do know that I was the first one to leave the depot. However, every ambulance had to have a snowplow ahead of it, or they couldn't move. But we got hit at 9 minutes after 12, and I got to the hospital at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By the way, let me back up. Bill went to the right-of-way fence. I went down and out, and Wayne, in the middle of the caboose, went straight back through the caboose door. So I got to the hospital. In fact, as I felt myself starting to sink, and by the way, the sheriff was riding in the ambulance with me, and I kept asking him, how close to New Hampton are we? And finally he told me, he said, we just went over the Great Western Track. Well, then I knew that it wasn't far to the hospital, and when I went in and saw the white ceiling and the bright lights, why, I just quit then. But when I woke up, was the next day, I believe, and my wife and my mother and my brother had to come down on a bus, because nothing was running, even way up in Minnesota this storm had extended. Then a taxi cab somehow got them through to New Hampton, and they arrived there. But I had been having what we call phantom pains for all this time while they were coming down, and a phantom pain does this. even though that leg was gone, and as I laid in bed, that leg would start crawling back up underneath me until the foot was way up between my shoulder blades. And after it would go past the point of where you physically could take it, from then on, it was as tough as it could be. I was like a wrestler. I was there pounding on the mattress, and they gave me hypos, which did nothing for me. But anyhow, the next morning then, my family arrived, and about 11 o'clock, the claim agent from Chicago arrived, a man by the name of Riley. And the first thing I told him about this phantom pain problem I was having, that either they're going to have to do something for me or put me to sleep, one of the two, because I can't take anymore. Well, he left, and he came back probably at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he told me, well, he said, they found your leg this morning, and it was taken up to Leroy, to the undertaker. And then they contacted my mother back at New Hampton, and she told them, because my family had come from the town of McIntyre, that they had a lot there with a baby that had died in infancy, and my leg was to be buried at the foot end of that lot. But the undertaker had it at the time we're talking about. But when I complained about this pain and that, why, he said that he went back and called him again, and he told him, he says it is in a box, but he says, I told them to go to the drugstore and buy all the cotton batting that they need and pack that leg so that it's perfectly firm and nothing touching the toe, and it's all done up in cotton batting so that this thing will stay there permanently. And he said, the undertaker told me, well now, yes, he says that leg is laying perfectly straight in the box. And when that man said perfectly straight, my leg snapped back into position. And in 45 years, it has never changed from that position. Even though I can still feel the outside ankle bone on my foot. I've had minor phantom pains just in the stump, but nothing like that other thing. Now, whether the claim agent even talked to this fellow up there, I don't know, or if it was just all a psychological thing. Whatever it was, I didn't care, it worked, and that's all I care. But the hospital was full of injured men, and my mother and my brother went back to town as soon as the train was running, but my wife stayed there with us. Bill, the conductor, and I were in the same room, and Eb stayed there with us the whole 5 weeks they were there. And there were some German nuns that ran this little hospital, and they had a rule that no one but patients and staff would eat or stay there, because the claim agent offered to pay him hospital rate rooms for a room for Ev to stay there, because she was taking care of Bill and me during the day, because the other nurses were more than burdened down with the people that were burned and all that. But there was no way that they were going to go for this. So he went down the street and he rented a room where Ev could stay, and he gave her a meal ticket where she could go to the restaurant in downtown New Hampton and eat. And okay, due to a little delay here, I'm going to back up just a mite, and I was telling you that the nuns that run the hospital wouldn't let Ev stay there, even though we wanted to pay him hospital rates for the room and for the food that she would eat, but they had a rule that nobody but patients and staff could eat there. So the claim agent went down the street and rented a room for her, and then she had to go downtown to New Hampton with her meal tickets and eat breakfast. However, Bill and I took care of it, because at noon and at supper time we ordered extra things on our tray. And so Ev ate with us, and she ate well, and whether they liked it or not, that's the way it went. But Ev was taking care of Bill and me, acting as a nurse, because as I said before, these nurses were all tied up with the fellows that were burned and other serious problems with them. But Ev stayed there with me the whole 5 weeks and made those long walks night and morning, and some of the days it was 20 below and the wind was blowing. And she just did a tremendous job. In fact, she was there with me until March 6th when they moved me back to St. Paul, and she rode back in the ambulance with me. When we got here, the doctor saw that we had a problem, and he had to prepare me for a second operation, which he did about 2 weeks later. They had to do the infection in the stump. They had to take off another 2 inches of bone so that he had flesh to form the leg for an artificial leg, which he did. And finally, after all that, the 14th of May, why, I finally got to come home from the hospital. And such a long ordeal that was. But getting back down to Alta Vista, that night when Wayne walked back to the depot and set the torpedoes in place, which is what the rules said to do, then he went in the depot and he talked to Paige Brown, the dispatcher. Then he had to walk back that quarter of a mile and then the full length of that train over those big snowdrifts to get up to the farmhouse where we were eating breakfast. But he made it, and he was there with us, and then, as I said before, then the three of us finally wended our way back to the caboose, where we were sitting, quietly visiting, up until the time that we were hit. Okay, now if you will bear with me, I'm going to back up here on a few things and update you on a few. That night, while we were at McIntyre in the depot, I wasn't aware that you would ever have lightning in a snowstorm, but I looked out the back window of the depot there sometime during the night, and there's nothing out back there, only plowed fields, and there was flashes of lightning going on there like it was the middle of the summer that you'd have at some lake or other, which surprised me because I'd never heard of lightning like that in the wintertime. And also, I mentioned before that I got my watch back, even though it had been whipped off of the end of my chain while I was spinning. After I was in the hospital 2-3 days, oh, by the way, before I get to that, I had the head of the caboose, as I told you, there was a car of apples. Well, that car was split open. After the caboose was compressed, why then they still split this car of apples open, so there was apples all over the ground out there. And the local farmers came over with their bobsleds and the team and shoveled up these apples and took them home and fed them to the hogs. So, several days after I was in the hospital, a farmer walked into the office, or into the room, and held up this watch. He says, "Is it your watch?" Well, the minute I saw it, I knew it was, because it was my grandfather's that my mother had given me to use when I went breaking on the railroad. So I said, "Yes, it's mine." I said, "Well, where did you find it?" Well, he said, I went out there with my sled, and I was going to haul some apples home. He says, "My first scoop of apples that I took, I threw them into the sleigh," and he says something went skidding way up to the front end of the box, which I jumped up in there and looked, and here it was your watch. So that was how lucky I was that I got that family heirloom back, even though it's not in very good shape. At least it showed us what time that we got hit. I'll go back to this gentleman named Paige Brown that told Wayne that morning in the depot at Alta Vista that he would protect the rear of our train, and then he turned around and started this locomotive out from McIntyre with an inexperienced engineer off from the branch line. It wasn't even off the main line. Well, when this thing was over, before the day was over, Paige Brown, who was a man, as I understand, over 60, he went home and he never came back to the office again. And a fellow by the name of Clar, who was the engineer, who didn't want to get out of a warm bed and make that run down there to help us out, which of course was poor judgment on the dispatcher's part, but by one locomotive and 6 section men digging out 60 cars in 20-foot drifts was like, was not much help in the first place, but that's the way it went anyway. But anyhow, Mr. Clar, after this was over, and by the way, before I tell you that, also there was 2 section men that were killed in this. One was burned and died at the scene, a young man with 5 kids from McIntyre by the name of Eastman. And then another section man, an older man from McIntyre named Butterfield. He was burned seriously, but he didn't pass away until at the hospital. And then of course Wayne, he was killed in this expedition. But Mr. Clar, where there was 10 kiddies without a father, and all, it finally got to him, and I heard later that he went over into Wisconsin and run a dairy farm for a while. And after that, later on to that, I heard one of 2 things. Either he ended up in an asylum for mental people, or that he committed suicide. I don't know which, but that was what happened to Mr. Clar. So there was a lot of sad things happened from this. A lot of people suffered a lot, but some of us are alive, and of course we grieve for those that we lost. I now have a little testimonial and a thing that I want to read here, and I typed this morning because there's things in here about Wayne that I want to be sure gets in here, because Wayne was a good friend of mine. By the way, Wayne was also known by a friendly nickname of Musty. I don't know where that name came from, but as long as I worked with him and around the railroad, he was known as Musty, and that was fine. Now, to start this thing, in May of '42, I bid in the job on this South Local where Wayne and Cap Mestet were working. And I was there until May of '43. So in other words, I worked with Wayne and Cap 1 solid year. And on that job, you work 5 days a week, Monday through Saturday. And you're out there from 8 to 12 hours a day. So you're working closely with these fellows, much more so than, again, after May of '43, I came back up to St. Paul and got in what's called the pool. And I think shortly after that, Wayne and his family moved from Hayfield up to St. Paul too. I don't know the exact date, but I know this, that it wasn't too long after both of us moved back up here that we happened to get in the crew with Bill Benz. And I worked with him again until the time of the accident. But now, here are some of the attributes that I have of Wayne. He was friendly, good-natured, always wore a smile. He was a good athlete. I'm sure he was quarterback on the high school team. He was intelligent and always conducted himself as a gentleman. Wayne was always a careful, responsible railroad man. He was aware of the dangers of our job, and he acted accordingly to avoid danger to anyone. He handled every act on the job, as they say, by the book. When he said he did something, you knew that it was done right. I had complete trust in Wayne, because mistakes usually were costly. Getting back to the accident for a minute, in reviewing the investigation of this accident, I saw that the Great Western mildly indicated that Wayne didn't put torpedoes down on the track near the depot in Alta Vista that morning. However, when Wayne and Bill arrived at the farmhouse that morning for breakfast, he told us that the guns, which we call torpedoes in railroad slang, that the guns were down, and he talked to the dispatcher. In my book, that closed the case. Later in the newspaper, it stated that the townspeople of Alta Vista also heard the torpedo's explosion, which finally answers the question if there was one. Wayne was a good family man, and we discussed our families many times. And here's a few of the memories that I have of Wayne. Wayne and I never had an argument that went beyond normal conversations, and we resolved the question in a gentlemanly manner. However, once in a while, when we were stalled waiting for another train to get out of our way, or we were delayed for one reason or another, why, he'd always challenge me to arm wrestle. Well, I always lost. Wayne was always in shape, and as I said, he was a good athlete. Fran, do you remember the night at Hayfield when you and Wayne took me over to Austin to the movies, and on the way back, the snowflakes were so large that Wayne couldn't see to drive? That was a scary ride, wasn't it? I still remember some of the cold days that Wayne and I put in on that local, and sometimes it took us 16 hours to go from Hayfield to Owine. But I also remember some of the warm days in the summer when it was really fun to be around the railroad, because it was just pleasant to be outside in the fresh air, and we usually made fun out of the job. I was always glad to see us get to Owine early on Saturdays, because then Cap and Wayne could catch number 25, the afternoon passenger train, and then they would be back home in Hayfield by 5 o'clock on Saturday, and that way at least they'd be home for the weekend. Even though I lived in Owine, I was still glad for them, because railroad men are away from their families way too much. The details of that trip, this trip that we were on of the accident, are still very vivid in my mind, even after 45 years. In closing, in Wayne, the railroad lost a good man. I lost a great partner and a great friend. And Wayne's family lost an irreplaceable husband and father. God bless him for the kind of man he was, what he stood for, and how he lived his life. Musty, I still love you, and you will live in my memories forever. Amen. To McIntyre, again that night when I told you that we, the crew, thought that the weather was unfit to go, but you remember Mr. Halverson, the superintendent of this division, was in St. Paul on the phone, and he told us that we should go. Okay, now let's go back to St. Paul, and I'm out of the hospital. My wife and I and the kids went up to the lake for a week, and then when I came back, I got an artificial leg, and at that point then I went over to Globe Business College, and I took stenography on one of those stenograph machines. And by May of '48, I hadn't finished the course, but I could see that I was never going to be a court reporter. So I went out looking for a job as a secretary. And before I did that, I wrote a letter to Mr. Halverson telling him what I was going to do, and I figured that he owed me an obligation of some kind after that night at McIntyre, and I just called this to his attention, just planting a seed. And I'm looking at a letter now dated May 8th, 1948, from Mr. Halverson, and we're going to take a picture of it for you. And it ended up that what he did, he called down to the stockyard in South St. Paul and got a hold of the Tony Olson, who was president at that time, his assistant. I can't tell you his name right now. His name was Jack something, but anyhow, he called me and told me to call this Jack, and I did, and I went to work at the Stockyards Company, and I was there from 48 until 59, when I went in the insurance business, and I pursued that until 1980, when I retired. Now, we're going to show you some close-ups of this scrapbook that my wife and I put together. By the way, let me back up to New Hampton for just a moment. I told you about the 5 weeks that my wife put in down there playing nurse to Bill and myself, and walking in the cold night and morning. My wife passed away on July 6, 1992, so it's been 5 months now since she's gone home to heaven. Now we'll get on with the book. Up 4? Okay. You tell me when, Joe.
Okay, should we switch the page, Joe? You got that one good enough? All right.
Okay.
Maybe you can read the headlines, Leo, a little bit.
Okay.
You do that
So
upside
this over here shows, if you can see it, this is the Rochester branch where Clark came in from and left, and supposedly was supposed to stay there. This is McIntyre, and here's Riceville, and here's Elma, and here's the 2 signals at Alta Vista and the depot, and out here is where our caboose at a quarter of a mile from the switch. And this is through this area that Clark ran through torpedoes and red lights to manage to hit us. And over here it says that 3 were killed in the crash. Can you catch this picture here, Joe?
That arrow there, what does that arrow point to, Leo?
That points to where Wayne was laying. However, it'll show it better on the professional, or the original picture farther back in the book. Should we turn the page, Joe? Okay. This was in the local newspaper here, probably the St. Paul Dispatch, which is Wayne and Bill and myself. And by the way, another thing connected with this, we left here on the 29th, and ordinarily we should have been back on the 31st, because Gene, my son's birthday, was the 31st. He would have been 3 years old, but I didn't quite get back in time for the birthday. And this I don't think you can see very well, but this is a runway up in the top of one of the boxcars. These burned men were skidded out of the locomotive on that walkway that was torn off at the top of the caboose, or a boxcar, one of the 2. Now this is, after Bill and I were there for a week or so, we run an ad in the paper, the Alta Vista paper, the county paper there, thanking the people from Alta Vista and the doctor and the nurse that came to the depot at Alta Vista that morning and administered help to all of the injured men. And these are the meal tickets, some of the meal tickets that they gave Ev to use in the restaurant there for her breakfast while she was there. And this map, or calendar I mean, Ev and I looked at that for a whole month of February, and I never saw such a slow-moving month in my life. I was so unhappy with it that when I left, I brought it home with me. But really, I was tired of looking at that thing. And this, I think, is just a letter, telling me of an investigation that was going to take place when I got back to town. And this is a resume of the investigation, and in here too, the representative for the Us Brakemen's Union, which Wayne and I belong to, brought out in this part right here what I told you before about the torpedoes being on the track, and that what we did was absolutely by the book, and the whole thing was entirely the Great Western's liability. And this is the lunch sheet that I made out in room 354 at St. Joe's Hospital. It's dated the 15th because on the 14th, my last day there, I would have filled it out for the 15th, but I didn't turn it in. I brought it home with me instead. So that is kind of, and another point of information, I was in room 354 in 1947 in Old St. Joe's. In the meantime, that has been changed to a hospice, and the last 12 days of my wife's life, she was in that hospice, only she was in room 357. That many years later, whatever, for 47 to 92. And that's just a telegram from Ev's sister saying she'd come and take care of the children. And this is a fellow that donated me some blood. This is the last page. Are you with me, Joe?
Yep.
This is the last page in my time book. And Dave, I think it says there, doesn't it? 4/30 of 76 on January 29. This is my last union dues. And so that's the trainman's dues there. Whatever it is, I don't know, but it's a receipt for something. And that was on my tray at the hospital on Easter. That's the time card that was in the pocket of my overall. And by the way, after a day or two in the hospital, the operating room did bring down my clothes, and the left leg on the overall was twisted like you would run out a towel. And of course there was blood all over it. And this was in the pocket of my overall, and also the chain that I told you I had the watch on. I got that chain back, but I don't know where it is. It's lost in the shuffle. This is just a list of the railroad men. They took up a collection for me all over the system and gave me some money. And this is a continuation of that. And over here too, and still more. Now, this was our church in South St. Paul. They gave us some money. And these are our neighbors on 10th Avenue North in South St. Paul. There's 2 pages of those on both sides. You get it, Joe?
Yep.
Okay. Now this over here, well, that's having to do with me going to school. The state did pay some of my going to the Globe Business College.
Release form?
Oh yes, that's the release that I had to sign when I settled with the company, and they gave me the check. I believe that's what it is. I can't read it. Does it sound like these?
Yep.
Okay. You got her, Joe?
No further claims against the company.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's this attorney told me. He said, don't take any job promises. I'll show you this. Can you get the close-up on this, Joe? I will tell you just a little story about that. How we fixed the time. You got any idea, Dave?
how to say the time on there, Joe?
We don't even, we have like 1 minute.
Okay.
1 minute?
1 minute?
Oh, well anyhow, this is the check that I got, even though it was 40,000, it sounded like a lot of money. We used it that. Okay, I don't mind showing you this. This is the check that I got from the railroad company in 1947 for the loss of my leg. It's $40,500. The $500 is for 2 artificial legs. But Ev and I treated that leg money very sacredly. We only spent it in dire needs. However, when in 1958, when Linda came along, our daughter, we had to move down to 7th Avenue South. We had to take 8,000 out of here at that time. But still, by 1959, when I went in the insurance business, there was only 3,000 left of this. So the Lord was good to us again. He got me into the insurance business, and there, through Him being with me, I did well. It was none of my own doing, but the Lord was good to us again. And from there on, we didn't have any trouble. Now this is from an attorney. Can you pick it up, Joe? An attorney by the name of McDonald from Minneapolis. I had a lot of ambulance chasers at the hospital after me, and this man advised me to keep them all away because he didn't think that I would probably need an attorney, but he would consult with me on the phone. He was a very nice man. He didn't hound me. And this letter he did write to me saying that he would take my case on, where's that 25?
25%.
There it is, right here, on a 25% basis. Can you see it? Okay, instead of 33 1/3, but he also said I should let him know when I got a settlement from the company, or an agreement, which I did, and he was honest enough to tell me, well, if you can get 40 for yourself, I'd have to get 65 or more for you to come out with that much, so he advised that I settled with the company, which I did.
Did you get 25% of that, or?
No, he didn't get anything.
Oh,
No.
oh, that's good.
He just told me to, he says, if you can get 40 in your hand, you take it. Now this is a better picture. That's that car of apples. You can see that. Yeah, see that whole, this is the caboose, what's left of the caboose here, and that's the wheels, isn't it? Yeah, that's the wheels off the caboose, and this is what's left of that car of apples that was ahead of the caboose. And, this,
That was a picture, was in the paper, wasn't it? And, the one had the
yes,
arrow?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, now this is the better picture, and right here, this X, my head was there and my feet were this way, and it was right from the bottom side of that cylinder that the hot water was dripping on the thigh part of my leg, where I still carry the scar to this day. And there's the door of the caboose. So you can see the caboose was compressed into about 2 feet, plus this, and this is that thing.
It's the top of the train that ran into you, right?
Yes, right,
Okay.
but right here, isn't that cushion I was telling you about?
Yes.
Yeah. This cushion is where Wayne was. Come out through the back door of the caboose. But that is the newspaper man that was up there gave me that. That's just some more photos, snaps that somebody had taken, probably the townspeople who stopped in to see us. And this is the railroad doctor, Dr. Kelly, that took care of me after I was up here, because he had to do a second operation on me to get my legs straightened out and all that. So that's the end of a long...
Present to the two families?
Yeah,
now?
okay. Yes, Dave thought of this, of putting it on, well, I'll go back a little further. Dave and Jeannie told Dave about my scrapbook. and he said he'd like to look at it, so he and Jeannie came up to the house one day a couple weeks ago, and we looked through the book, and I started telling Dave some of this story, and he thought that it was interesting, so he suggested then that we put it on video. And I said I'd be glad to do it. So we're doing it here today, and Dave is going to have copies made of it all so that he can give Fran and her family some, and I'll be able to get one for my family, for which I am most gracious to Dave for his graciousness in doing this. I think it really shows you what kind of a fellow Dave is, and he's a real pal that I've known for many years, and he's nothing but top shelf all the way.
Wonderful you are.